In the far northern reaches of the world, where the winters stretched so long that entire generations learned to measure their lives not by the passage of days, but by the slow return of the sun, there existed a civilization whose relationship with the natural world was unlike anything the modern mind can easily comprehend. The Norse people, those seafaring farmers and raiders and traders and poets whom history would come to call the Vikings, did not see the world the way we see it today, divided neatly into categories of the human and the animal, the spiritual and the material, the living and the dead. For them, the world was a single vast and breathing organism, a cosmic tree whose roots plunged into wells of unimaginable wisdom and whose branches held up the very sky. And within this tree, every creature, every stone, every gust of wind carried meaning, carried intention, carried the whisper of forces far older and far more powerful than any single human life. And among all the creatures that walked and flew and crawled through the Norse cosmos, two stood above the rest in spiritual significance. Two animals that were not merely symbols or decorations or pets, but were understood to be direct extensions of the divine, living bridges between the world of mortals and the world of gods. These two creatures were the wolf and the raven. And the story of why the Vikings held them sacred is not a simple tale of admiration for powerful animals, but a deeply layered spiritual narrative that reaches into the very foundations of how the Norse understood existence itself. A narrative that reveals truths about this civilization that are at once awe-inspiring and, in their darkest implications, genuinely terrifying. To understand why the wolf and the raven occupied such a central place in the Viking spiritual imagination, we must first understand the world as the Norse themselves understood it, not as a place governed by a single benevolent creator or by the cold impersonal laws of physics, but as a living, contested, deeply dangerous reality in which order and chaos existed in a state of permanent and precarious tension. The Norse cosmos, as it was described in the great mythological texts that survived the centuries, principally the poetic Edda and the prose Edda compiled by the Icelandic scholar Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, was structured around a vision of reality that modern scholars have spent generations trying to fully decode. At the center of everything stood Yggdrasil, the great ash tree, an immense and eternal organism whose three roots extended into three separate realms, one reaching into Asgard, the home of the gods known as the Aesir, another plunging into Jotunheim, the land of the giants who represented the raw, untamed forces of nature and chaos, and the third descending into Niflheim, the cold and misty realm of the dead, presided over by the goddess Hel. Within and around this cosmic tree existed 9 worlds, each populated by different beings, from the light elves of Alfheim to the dark dwarves of Svartalfheim, from the fiery realm of Muspelheim to the frozen expanses of Niflheim. And connecting all of these worlds was Yggdrasil itself, the axis around which all of reality turned. This was not an abstract theological concept for the Norse. This was the literal structure of the universe as they understood it, and every aspect of their daily lives, from the way they built their homes, to the way they buried their dead, to the animals they chose to honor and fear, was shaped by this understanding. Within this vast cosmological framework, the gods themselves were not distant, untouchable beings, but rather powerful, flawed, passionate figures who walked among the worlds, who fought and loved and schemed and suffered, and who, crucially, were not immortal in the way that the gods of other traditions often were. The Norse gods knew that they would one day die. They knew that a final catastrophe, called Ragnarok, would come, a twilight of the gods in which the forces of chaos would break free from their bonds and wage a final devastating war against the forces of order, a war in which most of the gods would perish and the world itself would be consumed by fire and flood before being reborn anew. This knowledge, this awareness of their own inevitable destruction, gave the Norse gods a quality that is almost unique in world mythology, a tragic grandeur, a sense of doomed heroism that permeated every story told about them, and that, by extension, shaped the way the Vikings understood their own lives. If even the gods could not escape their fate, then what hope did ordinary men and women have of avoiding theirs? And yet, the gods did not surrender to despair. They fought, they built, they loved, they sought wisdom, they prepared for the end, even knowing that preparation would ultimately prove futile. This was the spiritual template upon which Viking culture was built, and it is within this template that the wolf and the raven find their deepest and most terrifying significance. Let us begin with the raven, because in many ways the raven is the more immediately accessible of the two sacred animals, the one whose connection to the divine is the most clearly documented and the most widely recognized. The raven in Norse mythology is, above all else, the bird of Odin, the All-Father, the king of the gods, the one-eyed wanderer who sacrificed his own eye at the well of Mimir in exchange for a single drink of the water of wisdom. Odin is perhaps the most complex figure in all of Norse mythology, a god who defies easy categorization, who is at once the Lord of War and the Lord of Poetry, the god of wisdom and the god of death, the protector of kings and the patron of outcasts. He is not a comforting deity. He is not a god of mercy or of unconditional love. He is a god of knowledge, of power, of sacrifice, and of the hard, often cruel truths that lie beneath the surface of things. And his most famous companions, the two creatures most closely associated with him in nearly every surviving source, are a pair of ravens named Hugin and Munin. These names are not arbitrary. Hugin derives from the Old Norse word huga, which means thought or mind, and Munin derives from munna, which means memory or desire. Together, they represent the two fundamental faculties of consciousness itself, the ability to think and the ability to remember. And their role in Odin's daily existence was described with remarkable clarity in the Eddic texts. Every morning, at the first light of dawn, Hugin and Munin would fly out from Odin's shoulders and travel across the entirety of Midgard, the world of men, observing everything that happened, every battle fought, every oath sworn, every child born, every secret whispered, and every evening, as the sun sank below the horizon, they would return to Odin and perch upon his shoulders and whisper into his ears everything they had seen and heard. In this way, Odin maintained his knowledge of the world, his awareness of the doings of men and gods and giants alike, and the ravens served as his eyes and ears across a cosmos too vast for even a god to observe directly. But the significance of Hugin and Munin goes far deeper than their role as divine informants. In the poem Grimnismal, one of the great mythological poems of the poetic Edda, Odin himself speaks of his ravens, and what he says is deeply revealing. He says, in the translation that has become most widely cited, that he fears for Hugin, that he worries the raven of thought may not return from its daily flight, but that he fears even more for Munin, for the loss of memory. This passage has been analyzed by scholars for generations, and what it reveals is a profound anxiety at the very heart of the Norse understanding of consciousness. Odin, the wisest of the gods, the being who sacrificed his own eye and hung himself from the branches of Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights, pierced by his own spear, in order to gain the knowledge of the runes, this god of supreme wisdom is afraid. He is afraid of losing his mind. He is afraid of losing his memory. And in expressing this fear through the metaphor of his ravens, the mythology is telling us something extraordinary about how the Norse understood the relationship between the human mind and the natural world. The raven is not merely a symbol of thought and memory. The raven is thought and memory. The boundary between the bird and the cognitive faculty it represents is not a boundary at all, but a seamless continuity, a reflection of the Norse worldview in which the natural and the supernatural, the animal and the divine, were not separate categories, but expressions of a single, unified reality. This understanding of the raven as a creature that existed simultaneously in the physical world and in the spiritual world had profound practical implications for Viking culture. Ravens were, in the most literal and observable sense, creatures of the battlefield. Anyone who has studied the ecology of the common raven, Corvus corax, knows that these birds are among nature's most intelligent and opportunistic scavengers. And in the age of the Vikings, when warfare was a regular feature of life across Scandinavia and beyond, ravens would have been a constant presence in the aftermath of battle, descending upon the fallen to feed upon the dead. This biological reality became, in the Norse imagination, a spiritual truth of the highest order. The ravens that came to feast upon the slain were not merely scavengers performing a natural function. They were Odin's servants, Odin's eyes, and their presence on the battlefield was understood as a sign that the All-Father himself was watching, that he was choosing among the fallen, selecting those warriors whose courage and skill in battle had earned them a place in Valhalla, the great hall of the slain where the chosen dead, the Einherjar, would feast and fight and prepare for the final battle of Ragnarok. To see ravens circling above a battlefield was, for a Viking warrior both a comfort and a terror. A comfort because it meant that Odin was present and that glory was possible, and a terror because it meant that death was near and that the All-Father's gaze was upon you, and Odin's gaze was never something to be taken lightly. For Odin was not a god who rewarded the timid or the cautious. He rewarded the brave, the reckless, the ones who threw themselves into the chaos of battle without hesitation. And he had a well-documented tendency in the mythological sources to betray even his most devoted followers at the moment of their greatest triumph, turning victory into defeat so that the warrior would die in battle and thus be eligible for selection by the Valkyries, those fearsome female spirits who served as Odin's choosers of the slain. The connection between ravens and death in Norse culture was so deeply embedded that it manifested in virtually every aspect of Viking artistic and material expression. Archaeological evidence from across the Viking world, from the ship burials of Norway to the trading towns of Denmark to the remote settlements of Iceland, reveals an extraordinary proliferation of raven imagery. Ravens appear on brooches and pendants, on sword hilts and shield bosses, on the prows of ships and the walls of great halls. One of the most famous Viking artifacts ever discovered, the pair of gilded bronze weather vanes that once adorned the masts of Norse longships, frequently featured raven motifs, and the great raven banner, the Hrafsmerki, was one of the most feared symbols in the Viking military arsenal. According to multiple historical sources, including the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and various Icelandic sagas, certain Viking warlords carried into battle a banner emblazoned with the image of a raven, and this banner was believed to possess magical properties. When the raven on the banner appeared to flap its wings, it was taken as a sign that victory was assured. When the raven hung limp and still, it foretold defeat. The most famous of these raven banners was said to have been carried by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, the legendary Viking chieftain whose historical existence remains a matter of scholarly debate, but whose cultural impact is beyond question. And another was carried by the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, the battle that is often cited as the end of the Viking Age. The raven banner was not merely a military standard, it was a sacred object, a talisman that connected the warriors who fought beneath it to Odin himself, and its presence on the battlefield transformed the act of warfare from a merely human endeavor into a cosmic event, a reenactment of the eternal struggle between order and chaos that defined the Norse understanding of reality. But the raven's significance in Norse culture extended beyond the battlefield and beyond the figure of Odin, reaching into realms of practical seamanship and exploration that reveal just how thoroughly the natural behavior of real ravens was woven into the fabric of Viking life. One of the most remarkable accounts in Norse literature concerns the use of ravens as navigational aids during long ocean voyages. The Landnámabók, the medieval Icelandic book of settlements, tells the story of Floki Vilgertharson, a Norwegian chieftain who set out in the 9th century to find the land that earlier sailors had glimpsed far to the northwest, across the open Atlantic. Floki, who would later earn the nickname Hrafna Floki, Raven Floki, brought with him on his voyage 3 ravens, and he used them in a manner that reveals a sophisticated understanding of avian behavior and navigation. When he had sailed far enough from the coast of Norway that no land was visible in any direction, Floki released the first raven, and the bird, after circling the ship, flew back toward the southeast, back toward Norway, telling Floki that the nearest land still lay behind him. He sailed on, and after some time released the second raven, which circled the ship, and then, finding no land in any direction closer than the ship itself, returned and settled back on the mast, telling Floki that he was in the deep middle of the ocean, equidistant from any shore. He sailed on still further, and when he released the third raven, the bird flew decisively to the northwest, and Floki followed it. And in this way he found the land that he would name Iceland, a name inspired by the drift ice he observed in the fjords, a name that has endured for more than 1,000 years. This story, whether strictly historical or embellished by later storytellers, reveals a culture in which the raven was not merely a spiritual symbol, but a practical partner in the great project of exploration and settlement that defined the Viking Age, a creature whose intelligence and instincts were trusted enough to guide human beings across the most dangerous and featureless expanse on Earth, the open North Atlantic. The raven's role as a navigator in this story carries a spiritual resonance that would not have been lost on the Norse audience that first heard it told. Just as Hugin and Munin flew out each day to gather knowledge for Odin and then returned to share what they had learned, so too did Floki's ravens fly out into the unknown and return with information that guided human action. The parallel is not coincidental. It reflects a fundamental Norse belief that the patterns of the divine world were mirrored in the patterns of the natural world, that the behavior of animals was not random or meaningless, but was a form of communication from the gods, a language that could be read and understood by those who possessed the wisdom to interpret it. This belief system, which modern scholars sometimes describe as a form of animism or as a deeply integrated nature spirituality, meant that the Norse relationship with ravens was not one of simple admiration or superstitious fear, but was instead a complex, multifaceted bond that encompassed the practical, the spiritual, the military, and the cosmic. The raven was, in the fullest sense of the word, sacred, not because it was worshipped in the way that a monotheistic tradition might worship its god, but because it was understood to be a living manifestation of divine principles, a creature in which the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural dissolved entirely. And it is here, at the point where the raven's significance begins to shade into something darker and more complex, that we must turn our attention to the wolf, because if the raven represents one aspect of the Norse spiritual relationship with the animal world, the aspect connected to knowledge and observation and the gathering of wisdom, then the wolf represents something altogether different, something more primal, more dangerous, and ultimately more terrifying. The wolf in Norse mythology is not a single figure, but a constellation of figures, a family of creatures whose roles in the cosmic drama range from the loyal and the protective to the apocalyptic and the annihilating, and it is in the tension between these different wolfish identities that some of the deepest and most disturbing truths about Viking spirituality are revealed. We must begin, as we did with the raven, with Odin, because Odin's relationship with wolves is as central to his identity as his relationship with ravens, and yet it carries a fundamentally different emotional charge. Where the ravens Hugin and Munin represent Odin's intellectual faculties, his capacity for thought and memory, his two wolves represent something more visceral, more bodily, more connected to the raw, physical reality of survival. Their names are Geri and Freki, and both names carry the same essential meaning. Both can be translated as the greedy one or the ravenous one, a doubling that emphasizes not variety but intensity, as though a single word were insufficient to capture the depth of hunger that these wolves embody. According to the Prose Edda and the Eddic poem Grimnismal, Geri and Freki sit at Odin's feet in the great hall of Valhalla, and Odin feeds them all the food that is set before him, for the Allfather himself has no need of food. He sustains himself on wine alone, or in some versions on mead, the sacred drink of poetry and inspiration, while his wolves devour the meat, the physical sustenance that Odin has transcended. This detail is far more significant than it might initially appear. It tells us that Odin has separated himself from the animal need for food, from the bodily hunger that drives all living creatures, and has delegated that hunger to his wolves, who carry it for him, who embody it in its purest and most undisguised form. The wolves are, in this reading, the part of Odin that remains animal, the part that hungers and consumes and is never satisfied. And by keeping them close, by feeding them from his own table, Odin acknowledges that this animal hunger is not something to be denied or destroyed, but something to be accepted, honored, and controlled. This image of the god who keeps wolves at his feet resonated powerfully throughout Viking culture because it mirrored a reality that every Norse person understood intimately. The wolf, Canis lupus, was a constant presence in the Scandinavian landscape, a creature that the Norse encountered regularly in their daily lives, not as an exotic or distant animal, but as a neighbor, a competitor, and sometimes a threat. Wolves preyed upon the livestock that formed the economic foundation of Norse society, the cattle and sheep and goats upon which families depended for their survival. And in the long dark winters of Scandinavia, when food was scarce and the snow lay deep across the land, wolves could become genuinely dangerous to human beings as well. The howl of a wolf pack echoing across a frozen fjord on a midwinter night was not a romantic or picturesque sound to the Norse. It was a sound that carried real menace, a reminder that the wilderness was always close, that the boundary between the human world and the wild world was thin and permeable, and that the forces of nature could not be fully tamed or controlled, no matter how strong the walls of the longhouse or how sharp the blade of the axe. And yet, despite this very real danger, Or perhaps because of it, the Norse did not simply fear or hate the wolf. They respected it. They admired it. They saw in it qualities that they valued in themselves, qualities of strength, of endurance, of fierce loyalty to the pack, of relentless determination in the hunt. The wolf was, in many ways, a mirror of Viking society itself, a creature that survived and thrived, not through individual strength alone, but through cooperation, through hierarchy, through a willingness to fight for territory and to defend the group against all comers. This dual nature of the wolf in Norse experience, as both threat and model, as both enemy and kin, is reflected with extraordinary clarity in the mythology, where wolves appear in roles that span the entire spectrum, from the protective to the destructive. On one end of this spectrum stand Geri and Freki, the loyal companions of Odin, wolves who serve the king of the gods and who represent the disciplined, channeled form of animal power, hunger, and ferocity placed in the service of wisdom and order. On the other end of the spectrum stands a figure of such terrifying mythological power that his name has echoed through the centuries and remains one of the most recognizable images in all of world mythology. His name is Fenrir, and he is the great wolf, the monstrous wolf, the wolf whose destiny is to devour Odin himself at the end of the world. And his story is one of the most haunting and psychologically complex narratives in the entire Norse mythological corpus. Fenrir is the son of Loki, the trickster god, the shapeshifter, the figure who occupies the most ambiguous and troubling position in the Norse pantheon. And his mother is the giantess Angrboda, whose name means the one who brings grief. From the moment of his birth, Fenrir was recognized by the gods as a creature of extraordinary danger, a being whose power would only grow with time and who was destined, according to the prophecies that the gods could not ignore, to play a central role in the destruction of the world at Ragnarok. The gods, faced with this knowledge, made a decision that reveals one of the most unsettling aspects of Norse theology, a decision that speaks to the tragic, fatalistic heart of the Viking worldview. They decided to bind Fenrir, to chain him, to restrain his growing power not through destruction, for even the gods could not kill fate, but through deception and magical constraint.